Man behind the chains of rail! Get behind the rail! Man behind the chains of...
The sky over Arlington National Cemetery was a solemn gray as a faint drizzle fell over the white headstones. Rows upon rows of markers stretched into the distance, each one a silent tribute to a life given in service. At the heart of this sacred place stood the tomb of the unknown soldier, a monument of marble and reverence, guarded day and night by the unwavering sentinels of the old guard. On this particular morning, the faint sound of boots clicking against the wet ground broke the silence. A tall, stoic figure moved with precision across the plaza, a sentinel on his patrol. Clad in an immaculate uniform and holding his M14 rifle with flawless posture, the guard executed every step of his march with ritual perfection. His movements were deliberate, his gaze fixed, his duty unwavering. For anyone watching, it was clear that this was no ordinary soldier. This was a tomb guard, part of the elite group tasked with protecting the unknown soldier and honoring all those who had fallen but remained nameless. Ethan Reynolds had always dreamed of being a soldier. Growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania, he would listen to his grandfather's stories of World War II and look at the faded photographs of soldiers in crisp uniforms. But it was a family trip to Arlington when Ethan was 12 that changed everything. He remembered the moment vividly, the quiet, the reverence, and the sight of a sentinel pacing before the tomb of the unknown soldier. The guard's precision and presence left a lasting impression on him. "Who are they, Grandpa?" young Ethan had asked. "They're sentinels, son. The old guard. They're the best of the best," his grandfather replied. From that day, Ethan knew where his path lay. Years later, after graduating high school, he joined the Army. He worked hard through basic training, pushing himself to his limits, determined to achieve his boyhood dream. When he was assigned to the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, the old guard, he knew he was one step closer to the tomb. The day Ethan volunteered to become a sentinel was both thrilling and terrifying. He had heard the stories. How less than 20% of applicants made it through, how the training was unforgiving, and how failure was not tolerated. He met with the sergeant of the guard and, after a grueling selection process, was accepted into the first phase of training. The next 6 months tested Ethan like never before. The initial 2-week trial period was meant to weed out the uncommitted. Every step of the process demanded perfection. His ceremonial walk, his posture, and the way he handled the rifle had to be flawless. He spent hours memorizing the 35 pages of historical facts about the tomb and Arlington National Cemetery, reciting them over and over until he could speak them without pause or error. The remains of the unknown soldier were interred on November 11, 1921. He would mutter in his bunk at night. The tomb symbolizes all American soldiers lost and unidentified. Then there was the uniform. Every detail had to be perfect. The sentinel's uniform reflects the honor of the role, and no blemish, no wrinkle, no flaw could go unnoticed. Ethan spent hours in front of a mirror, shining his shoes to a glass-like finish, ensuring every ribbon and medal was perfectly aligned. His trainer, Sergeant Collins, was relentless. "The tomb deserves perfection. Reynolds, if you can't give it, step away now." But Ethan didn't step away. He pressed on through exhaustion, failure, and frustration. There were moments when he doubted himself, moments when he wanted to quit, but the memory of that 12-year-old boy at Arlington kept him going. He failed his first test but came back stronger, determined not to repeat his mistakes. Months passed, and finally Ethan reached the final test. His uniform was pristine, his movements flawless, and his recitation of the tomb's history impeccable. When Sergeant Collins handed him the Tomb Guard identification badge, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He was no longer just Ethan Reynolds. He was now a sentinel, a guardian of the unknown soldier. The morning of Ethan's first solo walk arrived sooner than he expected. At 5 a.m., he reported to the tomb quarters. The room was silent except for the faint sound of boots being polished and uniforms being adjusted. Ethan meticulously prepared his uniform, his hands steady despite his nerves. "You ready for this?" another guard asked quietly. Ethan nodded, though his heart was pounding. He had spent months training for this moment, and he knew what was expected of him. There was no room for error. At exactly 7 a.m., Ethan stepped out onto the plaza. The world outside the gates seemed to fade away as he focused on his task. The first steps were the hardest, but soon his body settled into the rhythm of the march. 21 steps across the mat, a pause, a precise turn, and 21 steps back. Every motion was deliberate, every movement executed with perfection. As the rain began to fall, a small crowd gathered to watch. Families stood quietly under umbrellas, children clutching their parents' hands. Ethan's gaze never wavered. He marched on, the rifle resting against his shoulder, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The rain soaked through his uniform, but he didn't notice. He was no longer Ethan Reynolds, he was a sentinel. His duty was to the unknown soldier and to the countless others who had given everything for their country. The day Ethan learned what it truly meant to be a sentinel came weeks later. It was a sunny afternoon, and the plaza was crowded with visitors. Ethan was on patrol, walking the mat as he had done many times before. Suddenly, a young man in the crowd began yelling. His voice echoed through the otherwise quiet cemetery as he laughed and called out to his friends. Ethan's jaw tightened. Disrespect at the tomb was unacceptable. The man stepped over the chain barrier, onto the edge of the plaza. The crowd fell silent as all eyes turned toward the intruder. Ethan halted mid-step. He turned sharply and faced the man, his voice booming across the plaza. "Halt! Behind the chain and round." The man froze, startled by Ethan's commanding presence. Ethan's rifle, though held ceremonially, was now a visible reminder of the seriousness of his role. The intruder quickly retreated, and Ethan resumed his patrol, the silence once again restored. For the crowd, it was a sobering moment. A reminder that the tomb was not just a tourist attraction but a place of honor and sacrifice. One story Ethan had always heard was the myth of the Sentinels refusing to abandon their post during Hurricane Isabel in 2003. The legend said that, despite orders to seek shelter, the guards remained outside, standing watch as the storm raged around them. "Is that true?" he had asked Sergeant Collins one evening. "Not exactly," Collins replied. "We have protocols for storms and dangerous weather. The tomb is guarded 24/7, but we take precautions. Still, it's the spirit of the story that matters. No matter what, we're here." Ethan would experience his own brush with a storm months later when a sudden blizzard swept through Arlington. Snow piled up on the plaza, and the icy wind cut through his uniform. But Ethan marched on, his step steady, his rifle secure. In that moment, he understood what Sergeant Collins had meant. The world could rage around him, but as long as he stood on that mat, he would hold his post. Years later, when Ethan finally left the old guard, he carried the Tomb Guard identification badge with pride. It was more than just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of everything he had learned: discipline, precision, and respect. He would often return to Arlington, standing quietly in the crowd as new sentinels walked the mat. One day, as he watched a young sentinel perform his walk, a little boy tugged on his grandfather's sleeve. "Who are they, Grandpa?" the boy asked. "They're sentinels, son." "The old guard," the grandfather replied. Ethan smiled. The legacy of the unknown soldier and those who guarded him would endure.